I hope you're all enjoying your lunch. I'm Jenny Cox. I'm the Executive Director of the High Tech Law Institute at Santa Clara Law School. We're a proud supporter of this event, and I really first want to just take a moment to really highlight the efforts of the students who really produced this event. The Institute's been a supporter. Professors Glancy, Ochoa have served as advisors in a very important way, but I've really witnessed through the fall the planning, the execution of this event, and it's just come off amazingly well. And I just want to stop to again give credit, even though the event's not over. I know it's just going to continue to be great, to the students who have done this. So I've really enjoyed listening to the morning session. I'm not a privacy expert. I've been in-house counsel in the Valley, and I just want to give a quick brief story that just reminded me of something that happened several years ago by listening to the commentators talk about this common tension that we have as individual citizens about how our private personal information is being used or used without our knowledge. How many of any of you in the audience have been a victim of identity theft? Is anyone? Okay, there are some. So you might know what I'm talking about. But the year was 2000, before the humorous Citibank ads many of you have seen. And I was sitting in my office as in-house counsel in a privately held company. So no Martindale Hubble directories. I rented. I had an unlisted phone number. So you can imagine I care about my privacy. It's probably harassment is the major issue I care about. But I got a phone call from MBNA. And a very nice woman, and she says to me, she said, did you recently apply for financing to purchase some Dell computers? And all these things start going through my mind, and one of the reasons I didn't start off right away and ask her, how did you get this phone number? And I knew that I had used MBNA 5 years before, and I was living a different address, I had a different job, so I was thinking that right away, how did you contact me? But a couple months before, I had gotten in the mail a invoice from Sears for some appliances that not only I had not purchased, but I never even had a Sears account. So I had handled that, and it was almost too easy when they just said, I'll just take care of it, don't worry. So what the woman from MBNA told me was, well, you are a victim of identity theft, and someone has been trying to use your information, and just walked through it. It was very helpful and gave me everything I needed to know to contact the credit agencies and report it and put a tag on my name, etc. But it just reminded me of who does have our information, how are they using it, and there's the big brother fear effect, and then there's benign or even potentially beneficial effects. So I still feel that tension, but it was reminding me of that this morning. So why I'm really here is to introduce our speaker. It's my honor and privilege to introduce Bill Fenwick. I'm sure that name is familiar to many of you. Bill is one of the true pioneers in the Valley, one of the principal founders and named partner of the leading Silicon Valley law firm Fenwick and West. What I hadn't realized until I did some research is the long-standing interest and contribution that Bill has made to the field of privacy that we are discussing today. I won't begin to do that legacy justice, but suffice it to say his involvement in the field goes back over 20 years to, among other contributions, testifying before federal and state legislatures with respect to the Privacy Act of 1974. So Bill has a perspective that many of us newer to the field of IP generally and privacy in particular do not have. Today he has generously agreed to share a paper he is writing on the topic of e-government. It's about the necessity of e-government, but also the hurdle e-government faces with respect to legitimate concerns of privacy and security of our citizens. So Bill is going to speak for about 20 minutes, and then we'll have an approximately 10-minute Q&A session. Bill?
Well, I hope I'm going to present a little different aspect of this issue that we've all been focused on this morning. And I'm referring principally to the overriding concern that all of us have with regard to the government's use of information about us. E-government has been defined by the recently maligned Wikipedia as the use of information and communication technology in internal processes of government and the delivery of government products and services to citizens and industry. Many of the technologies and implementation issues involved are the same or similar to those in the private and voluntary sector, while others are specialized or unique to the demands of government. What I'm hoping I can get you to focus on is that the job of the government really is to serve us. It serves us in many, many different ways, and we all have stories about our disappointments with it, but there are also stories that never get told about some of the benefits. The problem that government has is that it must have information in order to provide the services. Now, think about a world in which the government could not have any information about you. It's kind of like going to the doctor, you know, and you're looking pretty bad and you're feeling terrible, and you say to the doctor, "I'm sick." And the doctor said, I noticed there's some indication of that. What's wrong with you? Say, I'm not going to tell you that. Fix it. Because that's what you're talking about when you think about trying to prevent the government from getting the information that it needs to provide the services that we expect. Let me just state for you my thesis. I believe that implementing e-government at all levels, federal, state, and local, is something in which our society, if it is to remain a civil society, has no choice. Without e-government, we risk the transactions cost of governing rising to a level that precludes democratic government. And this is so because the number, speed, and complexity of social and economic transactions has and is increasing at a rate that could outstrip, if it hasn't already, the government's capacity to provide the necessary environment, conditions, and services that's required to facilitate a civil society. And I'm not going to lay a lot of statistics on you. When my paper is completed, it will have hopefully statistics that will support that case. But let me just use one indicia. When I first got out of law school, I went to work at a Wall Street law firm. And I got involved with what was a relatively small bank that was, among its other businesses, attempting to help the listed companies on the New York Stock Exchange get their books in balance. Because you never heard about it, because nobody ever wanted to talk about it. But in fact, the Fortune 100 companies, 95% of them had share books that didn't balance. That is, shares had been traded, some bought, some sold, and the two columns didn't add up. And of course, the job of the client that I was working for was to try to put that in balance. Now, at that time, there were 8,004,000 reported trades on the New York Stock Exchange in the year 1969. In 2003, there were 772,753,000 transactions. You like to calculate percentages? That's over a 9,500% increase in those transactions. I offer that to you only as an example. Another aspect of that that may help you appreciate it is that during that same period, the number of shares listed on the New York Stock Exchange increased by 2,500%. Fortunately, I came to California and I didn't have to struggle with that problem anymore about trying to get those darn books in balance. The point that is of significance to me in that is that we now have come to expect, and not only do we expect, but we absolutely have to have, all of the transactions that, those at least that are not criminal, in order to maintain our standard of living. And those transactions are principally being generated by the private sector. You know, if you go back just a few decades and you think about what the transactions cost were then and compare it to the present and the flow of transactions, I think you can begin to get the picture. Obviously, if there were no transactions, we wouldn't have any need for governance. But then that would mean that we were one person and the only person on the whole planet. Because when you get two people, particularly if they live in the same place, you now are going to have transactions. And if you have transactions, there's got to be a context in which those transactions can be carried out. Our situation is one in which we find there is a very important relationship between private sector transactions and governance. And it relates primarily to all those things that we don't like to think about: speed, complexity, the involvement. You know, if you went back those 5 decades, I never did hear the word globalization. I didn't hear that word until probably the early 90s. But think what that does to this whole business of transactions. Now, each government action has a cost. There's no doubt about it. It may be, you can think of it as being the salary of the people who are involved in the agencies. Now let me raise for you a topic that is going to hopefully not cause your eyes to glaze over. How many of you have heard of R.H. Coase? Mr. Coase was an interesting fellow. He worked at an interesting institution, principally the University of Chicago. He was an economist. And he became fascinated with this whole idea of transactions cost. And in 1938, he wrote a paper that was entitled "The Problem of Social Cost." In the paper, he said, in order to carry out a market transaction, it's necessary to discover who it is that one wishes to deal with, to inform people that one wishes to deal, and on what terms you wish to deal. To conduct negotiations leading up to a bargain, to draw up a contract, to understand or to undertake the inspection needed to make sure the terms of the contract are being observed. Now, there was another economist that was a contemporary of Dr. Coe's, and his name was Carl J. Dahlman. And according to Dr. Coe's, Mr. Dahlman captured the essence of what he was really talking about when he talked about social transaction cost. Mr. Dahlman's formulation is a bit simpler now, so I've chosen to use that because it's a little easier to remember. He said, look, what this really means is that there are three categories of cost. He says there are search and information costs. There are bargaining and decision costs, and there are policing and enforcement costs. If you think about that, it appears to me that the largest component of Professor Dahlman's three categories of cost is information cost. It is gathering and the cost of gathering. It's the cost of analysis. It's the cost of getting agreement on what actions are indicated by the information. And finally, it is the cost of getting that information out to the affected actors and monitoring their actions, and where necessary, forcing compliance. Now, if you look at that, if you think for a minute, government has to gather a lot of information. So you have a gathering function. And this dates back to the very beginning of our country. If you were to look at the Constitution, you'd find out that written into the Constitution is an explicit requirement for the taking of a census. Because, you know, if you're going to have all these 13 colonies and they're going to be doing all these things, we've got to figure out who we're going to be doing them for, and if you're a pessimist, who we're going to be doing them to. So they required a census, and that has continued. But the need for information about public policies and services is something that is done now by thousands of federal, state, and local administrative agencies, as well as some lobbyists. I sort of lowered my voice on that, right, because that's not a good topic right now. Mr. Abramoff has managed to paint a lot of mud on them, so I won't talk much about them. But that's how the government gathers that information. Now, they have all sorts of application forms that you are requested to fill out for various types of services. They try to provide a forum in which you can express your desires and your complaints. That information then has to be analyzed. The reason for the analysis is to try to figure out what is it that the public wants. Then there has to be a formulation of public policies. And that is a really tough process that we probably don't think enough about. I said I wasn't going to talk about lobbyists, but I will for just a minute. In order to get an agreement from a sufficient number of the government representatives that make policy, all kinds of compromises have to be made. And that's because they are attempting to represent such a great variety of what we call interest. Much of that interest is vested. So they do this process, and they create a lot of language, and we call those things statutes and regulations, right? We got a lot of folks in here that have a law background. You know how many thousand pages are generated every day of laws and regulations. Now they've got another problem, and that is they've got to figure out, once we've got all these policies, how are we going to implement them? Guess what? Information comes back into that very heavily. First of all, you got to tell people what the policies are. And then you got to be able to inform them about what they mean. Out trots the administrative agencies. I'm talking about federal, state, local. There's no government that I know of. Well, I heard there's a little town. It's got 5 people in it. And I suppose they don't have any administrative agencies. But every government at every level has administrative agencies. So they use those administrative agencies to disseminate all that information. But they're disseminating the information that's been drafted in all of these compromises. Because regulations come out pretty much the same way. There's a lot of back and forth, and ultimately they're a compromise. And now you have to get that information out, and you have to get it out hopefully in a way that it is understood. And there's been sort of a default there that was a necessity prior to the internet. And that default affects most of the people in this room. Because what has been used are lawyers. You know, these regulations and statutes are available in the public libraries, in most public libraries, but there's no way that that a private citizen can go into a public library and find out the answer to a question that is regulated or impacted by a statute or a regulation. It can't be done. So what happens is lawyers get involved in the process. You know what lawyers do to transaction costs, social transaction costs? There are roughly one lawyer for every 100,000 people, I'm told. I think there are actually more than that, particularly when I have to deal with things like competing with other lawyers and law firms. But we have the highest per capita ratio of lawyers to citizens of any country in the world. And our job as lawyers, mine, yours, requires us to add enormously to those transaction costs. If we had only 10 transactions, you know, probably be manageable. 1,000, well, but that's not the case. We've got trillions of transactions that are taking place daily now. And you know, the reason we can do that is because the private sector has learned about and implemented information technology. They have a wonderful motivation to do so. It's called profit, or alternatively, bankruptcy, or failure. The government is impacted by each of those transactions, but the government's current utilization of information technology is horribly deficient. The paper, when and if we get it completed, is going to take the position that if we don't permit government to use the information that they have to aggregate it and to mine it, and do that in large part with information technology, we're not going to be able to have a government that can survive. They just won't be able to. Think about that when you feel like ranting and raving about protecting your privacy. Understand, I have spent a little longer than Peggy indicated. I got started in this over 35 years ago. And the thing that has been very frustrating to me is that in that entire time, I have not seen anybody characterize information. And you see, I think, and since nobody's done it, they can't prove me wrong, right? I think that the secret lies in characterizing information. If you have a biologist, I had the privilege of representing Leonard Hayflick in a little explosion that took place back in the early 70s Leonard Hayflick was the man who co-invented the process for using human diploid cells to produce vaccine, because up until that time they used monkeys and chickens and things like that, and there were quite a few downsides to that. Many of you have heard of the monkey fever, I'm sure, and I'm reasonably sure that the thought now of using chickens to produce vaccine would get a bit of a reaction. But what he proved, because up until that time all of the biologists believed that if you took the human cell out of the body, an embryo cell, and you put it in your petri dish and you let it produce, it would reproduce forever. And so the head of the government agency that has a lot of impact on that, that is the Federal Drug Administration, would not permit the use of human diploid cells. And 10 years after the Europeans had satisfied themselves that you could produce a valuable vaccine with human diploid cells, the U.S. government finally changed its rule on that. Well, Dr. Hayflick had done all this work. He had all these. When he left the Westar Institute, they gave him 10 ampules of the embryo cells that he had been able to collect. They're called WI-38. The reason that they gave them to him is that he needed to have those cells characterized. That is to say, he wanted people to use them in their research and report back the results of that research, because that's what they had to do, and they have to do now, in order to be able to determine whether or not this carries hidden risk, whether or not it's effective. How does that relate to information? If you look at your name and your address, many of you, it's probably in the phone book, right? That doesn't seem to be a problem. But let's suppose that you are a witness against one of the prominent international gangs now, and you're going to be testifying in court. Change the nature of that address? You betcha. Those folks don't have any compunction about putting away witnesses before witnesses get the chance to be witnesses. That same information on your driver's license, absolutely essential. So my proposition would be that, look, we need to look at the application, and we need to look at information, and we need to characterize it in all of these different environments. Then we can start looking at how do you effectively protect it. That is, you preclude the harmful uses and you endorse the useful applications of it. Because if you don't do that, as I have said to you when I started, government can't carry out its function. It just can't. It has to have information to do that. And since it's not information about Mars, it's information about you. It's information about the institutions that you make up. I'm very worried, have been for a number of years now, that government is not going to be able to keep up. And you see, we've got this thing called taxes, right? It's pretty clear now. The American public is not very favorably inclined toward continually increasing taxes to pay for these costs. How can the government achieve its functions without increasing taxes? The answer is, if there is an answer, it's e-government. One more illustration of that. I've worked for about 12 years with the Judicial Council of the State of California in an effort to deal with what we call e-filing. And that's basically an effort to put into digital form all of the court records and the complaints and the answers and on and on and on, right? We had to do this principally because it was turning out that if somebody lost a file in a case, just by simply misfiling it, it was gone. Because there are something like 500 million files in the state of California. Would you like to look for a file misfiled in a file room that has 500 million files in it? Be sure you get a good retirement plan, okay? Because it's unlikely that you're going to find it. So getting back to our effort, one of the things we did is we went out, when we started out, the position that we took was, look, the first thing we got to do is we got to find out how technology is being used. Because our charter was figure out how to apply technology to the court system. So we said, well, you know, might be a good idea to start out with trying to figure out what are they doing now. And, oh yeah, one other thing. What kind of equipment do they have? We found counties that had 2 personal computers with no modem, nothing else. That's all they had. That's the only automation they had. We asked a bunch of the counties, we pulled together a conference of a bunch of people, said, now, the next thing we got to do is we got to figure out what is this information that you're using and you're generating, where does it go? And so we called this big session and we had them all up in Sacramento, and we said, now come in and prepare to tell us what you do with this information. One guy walked in there, I think he was from San Bernardino County, don't hold me to that because it's been a few years. He had this chart. It was as long as these 2 tables. And it had these little boxes on it. You've all seen them, right? Flow charts. Little bitty print. He said, well, I couldn't complete the job. I couldn't get it all done. I ran out of time. But what I've got here is a chart of the ones that I did do. It turned out that the court's information, just the distribution side of the court's information, he had on his chart 1,300 agencies that the court had to provide information to. How did he do it? Oh, they gave him a report. What did the agency do with the report? Well, if they were in San Bernardino County, they entered it into their database. Keyed it in. Now, understand, in some cases, the information comes out of a database. Point is, none of those databases were compatible. None of the records were compatible. So every time somebody, because all those 1,300 agencies, they generated, guess what? A whole bunch more reports to a whole bunch more agencies. And how did they transfer it? Oh, they sent them a report. Usually, it was on a court-approved form, right? So what do those agencies do it? They rekeyed it again. Figure out how long it would take you to get welfare or child support in a system where you got 1,300 agencies that are involved in the distribution of that information. And it's all being done semi-manually. That's why I think we've got to have eGovernment. I apologize for not being able to give you a little bit better presentation of what I hope will be our article. But I tell you what, back in the back of the room, incidentally, this is not an identification device, okay? This is not an FRID, I promise. Back in the back of the room, there are a box that has approximately 69 now, because I have one of these flash memories. They have the article on it. I tell you ahead of time that the reason that I put them on the flash is that if you want to give me some feedback, the links are active. You can check it out. Now the part you're going to be angry about is don't try to print it out and take it home, because it's locked. You can't print it. You can't type on it. I did that principally because I was concerned that the document would get out in the draft form before it has been properly completed. But if you go back there, there's somebody back there that will do this, right? Would you hold up your hand? The person that's going to, there you go. you get this, and if you have a USB bus on your computer, you get a little bonus. Because you see, that paper doesn't take up much of this device, and this becomes a portable disk. You can use it on your computer. You can put your papers on it. You can take them somewhere else and read them on somebody else's paper. So the draft of the paper in its current form is on this. I appreciate your attention, and I will be most interested in getting your feedback, both in your questions and in any other form you want to give them to me. I don't think you'll have difficulty finding me. You don't have to go to Choice Point. Just Google me. You'll get my email address, my telephone number, hopefully not the names of my grandchildren, but who knows. In any event, please feel free. Michael Blum and I, Michael is my co-author, he's sitting back here, are going to be trying to finish this little gem up in the next month. Give us whatever comments you might have. Hopefully you'll use the right kind of language. See, my grandkids sometimes read my emails, not because I necessarily want them to, but because they like to play video games, and so they can now do my computer quite well, even with my efforts to put security codes on it. So don't feel, vent your anger, just do it in language that my grandchildren won't learn any new words from. All right?
Thank you, Bill. I'll take questions for you. Okay, well, we'd like to offer for questions for Mr. Fenwick. Professor Friedman?
It seems to me that there are two ideas, two assumptions that underlie your argument. The first is that government is our servant, that it basically is out there doing good, and it needs more information with which to do more good. And the second is that if the total volume of transactions, of stuff happening, goes up, size of government has to go up as well. And I think those are both odd positions to hold for somebody who's read the work of Ronald Coase, who is a man I have great regard for, an ex-colleague, and a very fine economist. To begin with, one of the things that follows from Coase's arguments is that the mechanisms by which we try to control government, try to make sure it do good things, face enormous transactional cost problems. That in order for the voters to vote in the good guys and vote out the bad guys, they have to know who is which. For some odd reason, congressmen never introduce bills to Congress which say a bill to help farmers and hurt city folk. They always put it in a way which pretends to help everybody, so there are large information costs to the individual voter in finding out what his representatives are doing and why. And there's very little incentive to bear those costs because each individual voter knows that he faces an enormous public good problem that his vote won't affect very much. So what we actually observe is that government sometimes helps us, sometimes hurts us, sometimes our friend, sometimes our enemy, is often a mechanism by which some people benefit themselves at the expense of other people. And given that, giving government more information is very much a double-edged sword. That to the extent we reduce privacy and give government more access to information, yes, it is better able to help us, but we are less able to defend ourselves against it. You may be familiar with Thoreau's classic comment, if I were certainly assured that a man were coming to my house to do me good, I would flee for my life. The second point is that if the volume and complexity of transactions increases, and if government is a rather clumsy mechanism for dealing with issues, that's an argument for shifting more and more things away from government. That of the transaction costs that you describe and that Coase describes, all of them are costs that are handled on the private market as well as on the political market. And in fact, I happen to have a chapter in a recent book called The Half-Life of Policy Rationales, which argues that various of the technological developments that have been occurring make it possible to reduce the size of government. That the argument for government doing this, that, or the other frequently depends on market failures, depends on transaction costs, and one of the beauties of modern technology is that it is sometimes possible to reduce those costs in ways that allow the market to solve problems that it could not solve as well in the past. So as I say, it seems to me the two problems with your argument from a Coasean standpoint are the assumption that giving government more information is simply a good thing because the government's just out there trying to help us. You know, I'm from the government, I've come to help you. Most dangerous words you can hear. And the assumption that increasing the complexity of the system is an argument for more government instead of for less. Thank you.
Well,
by the way, there are only 68 of those, by the way. So thank you.
All right. My answer to you would be this. I have tried in what I'm trying to do to not come out in favor of the Democrats, the Republicans, the Bush administration, or anybody else, because I don't think that's the way to deal with the problem. As to the assumptions that the government is good, I think the only thing we can rely on there is that we have a system as clumsy as it is, and it can get a lot more efficient, incidentally, with the employment of information technology to throw the rascals out. So I don't make any assumption with regard to the fact that the government is good. My assumption is that we will be able to figure out a way to make the government do what it needs to do if we have the information to do it. The Internet has greatly increased that ability. It also brings with it some downsides. And what I'm referring to is the transition that's taking place now in media, in mass media, and in bloggers. I don't know, I haven't kept score on it, but I suspect that you're going to find, if anybody ever does the research, that bloggers have killed as many good programs as they have prevented bad ones. But the bottom line is you can get a lot of information. And you're right, there has not been the kind of full disclosure that one would like with regard to whether this bill helps you or hurts you, depending on what your occupation is, or hopefully not what your religion or your political affiliations are, but there may be reason that you could raise that question now. In any event, I don't think that that matters. As for the total size, I think that my whole proposition is that you can reduce the size of the federal government if you can get, or I shouldn't say federal government, you can reduce the size of government if you can get them using IT the way they should be using it and the way the private sector is using it. As to what the impact of that's going to be, government doing it versus private, I don't take a position on that. There are some things that private industry certainly does better than the government. There are some things that the private industry can screw up much better than the government. And I think if you go through this characterization that I was talking about before, and you look at your objective, you can figure that out. I dread, and maybe I won't have to worry about this because maybe I'll be gone before all the information comes out. But I have a feeling that we're going to, for the next 15 years, be treated with a continuing diet of how the money was wasted in Iraq by having it put into the pockets of local politicians, bandits, and others. But that's just going to be there. And if you can, in fact, monitor, my biggest problem right now with this whole business of the NSA and its operation is that I would like to know that somebody is monitoring it. That at some point, somebody, if they have screwed it up and done it wrong, the society's going to know about it. And we can then remedy that problem. But what you said, volume and complexity, I don't think the government has any control over that. It will disillusion you to find out that I campaigned very hard, personally, against the Privacy Act of 1994 when it was applied to the private sector. Because that original bill wasn't just to control information flow in the government. It was to control information flow in our society. So I get on the plane and trot down to Washington and I say to the politician, you know, look at this provision right here. See that one? Now, let's take a situation. Let's suppose you have to run for office next year. And you've got reliable press sources that say that your opponent is a 5-time convicted felon who beats his wife, abandons his kids, and has continually abused everybody that's come in touch with him. And you get that press thing and you say, I'm going to be good, I'm going to document, I'm going to put it right here, and the next time I get up on the stand and I'm going to tell the people about it. That act prevented them from doing that. That was the most effective example that I had. Not by itself, because there were a lot of other people that were concerned about it, but we eventually convinced them that what they ought to do is they ought to be concerned about government's use of information, and let's make the government the guinea pig. Because if things in this bill are as screwed up as some of us think they are, it's better that they be inflicted on the government first before you inflict them on the people. Whether that position persuaded or not, I don't know. I was reminded this morning of a part of that discussion was Sam Irving's staff, because we went to see them. The 1974 Privacy Act was a monument to Sam Irving. It was the last bill that Sam Irving was supposedly the author of. It was passed in great respect for him. But he told me a story that came up this morning. He said, if you give me 12 really bad examples of something that's being done or that the government is doing, I can get you a law. Because I'll bring them in here, they'll testify about it, and we'll have a law. That'll prohibit 12. That's all he needed. That's frightening. That's very frightening to me. But it is nonetheless the case. I think the thing that I'm looking for here is the thing that we started out today when they were talking about the sunlight. I like that idea of having a way of getting transparency. And if you can get the government to implement eGovernment, and you can get the proper monitors set up, you might have that transparency. You will not get it with what we've got now. And I don't think that it's going to get any better. I hope I addressed your questions without venturing too far afield. If I haven't, you can pound on me later.
Thank you. Well, I'm getting the signals that our schedule needs to progress. So I think Bill has said you know how to reach him, to give him comments and feedback. And we'll also have other breaks in the afternoon. So again, thank you very much for that.